Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's QA Wolf webinar, How Billing Models Shape the Total Cost of Ownership in QA. I'm your host, Caleb Masters, and too often the total cost of automated QA testing is confused with the cost of building the initial test by the internal QA team. But I think as many of us know, QA is not a one and done thing, but rather an ongoing investment. And to offset these costs, engineering leaders often turn to outsourced QA contractors, which could include offshore contractors, to do the labor, which actually makes costs easier to measure in the long run. So, keeping that in mind, maybe you're asking yourself, what can I be doing to ensure that I'm getting the greatest ROI from our outsourced QA? And that is why over the next 30 or so minutes, we're going to be talking about how to understand the total cost of ownership for your QA and also the primary cost drivers that often balloon the cost of hourly contractors. But before we go any further, I want to welcome the real star of today's presentation. He is going to be my co host. He is the QA Wolf co founder and also QA Wolf's head of growth, Scott Wilson. Scott, welcome.
Hey, Caleb, thank you so much.
All right, Scott, a lot to cover today. Let's give folks a little peek at what we'll be talking about. First up, we're going to be discussing why sweet size and run cadence are the main cost drivers in automated QA. We'll then move on to talk about the impact that different billing models has on that long-term total cost of ownership. And then we'll close out the conversation by doing a cost comparison between the popular billing models used by automated QA vendors. But let's start things off just by understanding the total cost of ownership in QA. And maybe, you might want to understand what exactly do we mean when we say total cost of ownership. And that's why we provide a little chart that you can see on your screen here demonstrating how costs can go up over a 5-year period of time. So, Scott, with that said, I want to turn it to you. Why is it so important to consider the full investment of an automated QA contract when looking at vendor options?
Sure. Thank you, Caleb. The quick answer is QA is an ongoing recurring expense and not a set it and forget it implementation. That's kind of the summary of this entire presentation. We'll get into why we believe that and also show some evidence of that. But really, it's a part of your team that's going to scale with you, presumably indefinitely, as your team grows. So it's important to look at this purchase or rather investment over a long time horizon versus just a few months or even a single year. So really, the underlying question that we're looking to ask or answer is what will the full investment of an automated QA contract cost your organization in terms of both time and money over the entire duration? So I've seen a lot of different engineering leaders, different finance leaders. Their approach to purchasing a QA solution is they really focus on the upfront numbers, which are the licensing fees, the hiring costs, or the implementation expenses. And while these are valid considerations, they're really only scratching the surface of what you'll be paying for in the long term. So focusing solely on these metrics really often misses what's really involved in paying for labor and when you're paying for a QA solution to come to your organization. So they're not really telling the whole story, and that's what we're going to do throughout this total cost of ownership webinar. And what we'll find out is what we believe is the reason for exponential growth, and we'll show this is that there's two huge correlations. One is the suite size, and one is the run cadence. So the size of automated tests that you have, and then also the frequency at which you're running those automated tests.
All right. Well, again, bold statement there, Scott, jumping right to our conclusion. So I have to ask the question, how did you arrive at those two key variables as the main cost drivers?
Thank you for asking, because that's exactly what we're going to get into. So, to understand these primary drivers, we need to understand what actually goes into a single automated test or hundreds of automated tests.
All right. Well, Scott, I was curious, but to quote one of my favorite movies, now you have my attention. Let's go all the way and take a look at a single test. Let's dig into it. So I think that understanding exactly what goes into a test is going to be a really powerful way to really break down where costs could be hidden at, Scott. So take it away. Walk us through it. What all goes into a single managed test?
We wanted to approach this pretty scientifically. We didn't want to just make up data. So, what we did is we looked into all of our different, we aggregated all of our portfolio of all the customers that we have. And we wanted to see, like, what is the data actually showing us and what story does that tell? So, when we look at our entire portfolio of customers, we have over 3.5 million automated test runs that we've been able to look at and see what is the labor involved, what's the compute time involved on average across all these different customers. The other thing that we did is the other data point is that these 3.5 million test runs come from over 400 test suites with over 100,000 automated tests spanning from fintech companies to healthcare, even to some dev tools and LLMs that you're familiar with. But as we get into this, it's worth noting that the times that we're going to mention are times from our own data. And so the reason I say that is our platform and our technology already gives us and our customers a little bit of an advantage of how quickly we're able to run through things. So if something takes us 15 minutes or 20 minutes, it's probably going to take other tools much longer to do that, especially traditional outsourced QA. So if someone's just using a Selenium or a Cypress, but they don't have the QA Wolf technology on top of it to make it quicker, it's probably going to take a little bit longer. We do have a separate webinar on that called the QA Wolf Advantage, which goes into the details of what that technology looks like. But I just wanted to mention that as a quick caveat. But here's the big picture of what we're looking at on this slide right here. And here are the different steps. And then we're also going to go into what each of these steps means, and then also the average time that is associated with them. But when you're really looking at this, there's going to be 4 main steps and then 7 total steps along the way.
All right. Well, Scott, take it away on the first one. I think first up we have test creation time. So tell me a little more about this.
Yeah, this is the one that when you think of automated testing or automated QA, this is typically the first thing that comes to mind. And for a lot of folks, it's one of the only things that come to mind. And so this is test creation. This is creating that first test or creating the first 100 tests to be able to then run those and be able to test your app. And when you look at this, it's really mostly a one-time cost. It's not really a recurring labor cost. So you're going to have an average, what we found is about 95 minutes of time that goes into this. There are going to be some tests that maybe only have 200 lines of code. There's going to be other tests that have thousands of lines of code. And so when you're looking at this, what we're trying to do through this presentation is show that there's kind of a bell curve that happens. So when you look on the left-hand side, there are going to be tests that take less time. On the right-hand side, on the tail end, there's going to be tests that take way more time. But on average, we're landing at about 95 minutes. So definitely consider this when you're thinking about how many tests you might need. But again, this is more or less, this is going to be a one-time cost. But for any net new tests you create, you're going to need to pay that along the way.
All right. Well, Scott, walk us through what's the next step.
Yeah, so the next step is going to be test runtime. And so this doesn't really include labor. The only labor that it would include is if we call it babysitting test runs. So if it running your suite takes 10 minutes or 30 minutes, that may not be enough time to context switch and go on to work on something else. So in the meantime, what we've heard is your devs might go play ping pong, or they might go grab coffee, or they might just kind of wait around for this thing to run. And so technically there's a labor cost, but it's almost too hard to track. So what we're going to focus on here is the compute time involved. And so when you're looking at test runtime, on average, it takes about 9 minutes. Again, a really simple login flow might only take about 3 minutes. But then there are going to be some tests that take upwards of 30 minutes, 40 minutes. It's really like what is the quickest way that you can get through a test. Now, if there's a 30-step test, it's going to take longer than a 2-step login test. And so on average, what we found is that 9 minutes is generally the average runtime for a single given test.
All right. And of course, I know the next step here is a pretty big one. So just to recap, though, test creation, test runs, and where are we going next?
Yeah, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get into what happens when a test runs. And so the answer is they're either going to pass or fail. And so when something passes, it really doesn't need any more labor associated with it. But when something fails, now you need to investigate it. You need some way to look into that failed test and figure out what happened with it. And we'll get into in a second what are the different outcomes for a failure. Um, but the thing to take into account now is about 15% of any test suite is going to fail. So if you have 100 tests, you can imagine that 15, or you can bet that about 15 are going to fail for you. And so our failure rate, the quick formula for it is number of tests minus number of passes divided by 100, and that gives you the failure rate. And so, like I said, if you have 100 tests, about 15 are going to fail because we found across all of our 3.5 million runs that about 15% are going to fail.
All right. So you already sort of teed it up a little bit, but what happens when the tests fail? Walk us through those different steps of the process.
Yeah, so that next thing is going to be investigation time. So, like I said, you have these tests that failed. Now you actually need, whether it's technology or human, you need to look at these. You need to investigate, why did this test actually fail? And if you have 15 tests, you're going to have to investigate 15 separate tests. And so what we found, again, the same bell curve, some will take longer, some will take shorter, but we found it takes about 17 minutes on average to investigate a single failed test. And when you investigate a single failed test, it's going to turn into one of three things. Um, It will be a flaky test, so about 45% of the time. And that means that after you rerun this test, it's going to end up passing and it needs no more labor. So 17 minutes for that failed test is all you need for a flaky test. Now, what we'll get into later is you will need more compute time because you're going to want to rerun that same flaky test about 3 times to make sure it was just a performance or network issue. The second thing that can happen to a failed test is it can be a truly broken test that needs maintenance. And so this happens about 50% of the time. So if you have 100 tests, 15 fail, about 7 to 8 of those are actually going to need someone to go in and fix that broken test and repair it. So you have a total maintenance event. And then finally, about 5% of failed tests are going to result in a bug. And there's also labor that goes there that we can get into as well. But those are the 3 areas that you're gonna find out when you investigate a test.
Break it down for it. Yeah, break it down for us, Scott. How much time goes into each one of those?
Yeah, so flakes, again, about 45% of them, they're gonna rerun, they're gonna pass, there's gonna be no more labor there. Maintenance and bugs are really where you start seeing labor, compound on top of each other. So maintenance is on average going to be about 45 minutes. So this is the time spent repairing a broken test and returning it to a test suite. And now you rerun it, so more compute time, and then it passes and you send it off and no more labor needed. Then there's going to be the bug reporting, which happens 5% of the time. So this is on average going to take about 30 minutes. So this bug reporting is the time you need to manually reproduce a failed test, and then also have the video, the logs, and communicate it to the team of why it failed.
All right. I think this has been a really helpful and thorough breakdown, Scott. So again, if the test fails, the investigation, maintenance, and reporting steps is going to take up a considerable amount of time. And based on the math you provided here, it looks like an average of 92 minutes per test. At least among QA Wolf customers, if you're running 100 tests and then 15 of those fail, it will take you an estimated 23 labor hours to fix. So again, I think this is a really great way, Scott, this overview, just laying out each step. It's a great way to help us understand exactly which components tend to take up the most time. Now that we've talked about that, though, let's turn it back to how each one of these steps that we've just talked about informs those main cost drivers of suite size and run cadence. Now, of course, one way to be proactive in keeping costs low is to understand what's causing the variability in the labor hours of the time spent running a test suite. And Scott, you just highlighted this. Maintenance, especially, tends to be a pretty big one, maintenance and investigation. How does this variability in the testing process that you just talked about inform the main cost drivers of suite size and run cadence?
Yeah, so to illustrate this, we're going to show 4 different scenarios that we've come across at QA Wolf. This is going to help us demonstrate how suite size and run cadence help drive up the total cost of ownership. So let's talk about that to really get into what that looks like. So the first one, scenario one, its test suite remains the same and test cadence remains the same as well. This scenario is typically seen in very mature products, products without large engineering focus, or products or companies that are just not in the moment prioritizing innovation. Next, let's move on to scenario two. So scenario two is the test suite grows, but cadence remains the same. So this is a bit more atypical and less observed. It indicates that a product is growing and presumably the engineering team, but the frequency at which tests are being run remains flat, which in our experience is really a symptom of not having enough resources to be able to test as often as desired, though typically the teams want to continue testing. So that brings us then into scenario three. Also kind of similar, test suite remains the same, test cadence increases. It's not as rare as the previous scenario, but it is also fairly uncommon. This usually indicates that the product is indeed growing, but the team just hasn't allocated enough resources to keep up with creating tests for the new features that they're developing. In both scenarios 2 and 3, what you're typically going to see, if you have a long enough time horizon, the team is growing and eventually they're able to either reprioritize this or they have new funding or whatever it might happen, they usually go towards scenario four. And so, scenario four, this is really where innovation, go to market, and growth are a top priority. And in this scenario, the test suite grows and the test cadence increases as well.
Right. Well, Scott, this is a really thorough set of charts here. Just looking at, obviously you've got the metrics breaking down there, but even just looking at sort of like the way the curves operate, it's pretty clear that scale and release cadence are making a pretty substantial impact here. Of course, we've talked about it. When you're running just one test, life is easy. a few dozen minutes here and there of maintenance or bug reporting, this isn't going to break the bank. But what if you're running hundreds of tests, like what Scott's got on slide here, and they're running every single day? That's when this cost of test management is really going to get quite expensive pretty quickly, especially, again, going back to that 15% failure rate that Scott mentioned a moment ago. This could require pretty considerable maintenance or bug reporting time on any given test. So, Scott, I think, like you said here, I mean, if you're a company looking to expand the product roadmap over the next 1, 3, or 5 years, this is something really you should be considering is that overall long term costs.
Yeah, so this is exactly what we're talking about. Is you can't just look at this in an isolated single year. You should really be looking at it over the course of a 5-year period, because at minimum, that's what companies want to adopt. They want to have something that has a long term solution for their engineering team. And so to prove this out, let's apply the logic of these scenarios. Let's look at the three most relevant scenarios. So that's going to be number two, number three, and number four. So suite size increases, cadence remains the same. Suite size remains the same, cadence increases, and then finally suite size increases and cadence increases. So this is the suite size increases, but velocity remains the same. So to run this through this really quickly, I'll read out the different scenarios, what's happening here, and kind of what's happening to make this math show up on this chart. So let's say your suite size starts at 250 tests in year one and grows by 10% each year. The hourly rate at $65 an hour stays at $65 an hour. So that's how much you're going to pay an outsourced team to do this. In year one, the creation costs are $32,500. These are more or less one time costs as they drop off considerably in year two and beyond. You'll have a minimum of 5,000 minutes per month build, so that's in the compute time. Total maintenance, now, as we go back and remember what goes into a test and all the different probabilities of tests failing and then of the ones that fail that need maintenance, total maintenance, including triage time, there's going to be bug reporting. All those labor hours come out to about $10,000, $10,200 a month, or about $122,000 a year. And then by year five, the total maintenance balloons to $234,000. Let's move on to the next scenario. So that's scenario number three. So this is where the suite remains the same size, but velocity increases. So you have 250 tests you plan to run a month. After the $32,500 creation cost in year one, this cost drops to zero. At 1,000 runs a month, releasing once a week, you see a 15% failure rate of 150 tests. The maintenance cost on these failed tests is about 10,200 or $122,000 a year. That's what we also mentioned scenario 2, right? So as your engineering team grows and as you ramp up the speed of your release cycle, you increase the cadence of which you test your entire suite. So you're increasing the number of runs to 2,000 runs a month, releasing twice a week. The cost doubles. So by year five, you're taking 25,000 testing minutes a month to run 5,000 tests 5 times a week. The higher test failure rate results in more maintenance time. By year five, the maintenance costs have increased all the way to $614,000. So that's a 400% increase from year five to year one for those maintenance costs.
Scott, I don't want to cut you off here, but I just got to say, and I know there's still one more scenario to walk through, but when you're laying all those numbers out and just seeing how fast these things can grow with that increased, sort of release velocity, the additional runs really seems like it's racking up the hours hand over fist. So, like you said, the more runs you have, the more failures you can expect to see due to those flakes, the maintenance of the bugs we talked about, and the more failures you have, the more times you're actually going to have to rerun the suite, which again is going to increase that infrastructure cost that you've already mentioned. Looking at this and thinking about terms of release velocity, those additional test runs almost operate like a sort of a compound interest, like not unlike a loan, just balloons very quickly over time.
Yeah, and it gets even larger as you look at scenario four, right? So we've been looking at scenarios that have one or the other, and now we're going to look at a scenario that has both. So the suite size is increasing and the velocity is increasing. And really, as we get into this one, I think this is a really good indicator of why a lot of teams don't have high automated coverage, or if they do have high automated coverage, they're not really utilizing it that well. And one of the answers, assuming that things are fast and things are running quickly and they have parallel testing, it's expensive. Historically, it's expensive to do this. And that's why a lot of teams, that's why when you see very large companies still have bugs, this is one of the big reasons why, is that to prevent these bugs and to check for these, it's just way too expensive. It's not very feasible to do so when you're paying by the labor hour. So when you look at this, when both things increase, your suite makes that same 10% increase each year at an hourly rate of $65 an hour. So we're making these assumptions, right? That things are going to grow 10% year over year. We're going to keep the $65 an hour. You're also going to increase your weekly run cadence each year to accommodate for a growing engineering team and a faster go to market. So in year one, we started 150 failures from 1,000 tests running once a week. In year two, we increased to 2 runs per week to account for the higher number of failures. This puts us at 275 tests running twice a week. Following the same increased cadence, by year five, we have increased to 366 tests running 5 times a week. When you combine the increase in test suite, the test runs you'll need to maintain the same quality and the labor of maintenance increases significantly. So maintenance goes in year one from $122,000 a year, which we've mentioned in all the other scenarios, to 899,000 by year five. So you can see how, year one, it doesn't really give the exact state and situation of where you're going to face in year five. And all too often, a lot of folks don't really account for the exponential growth of the labor involved there.
Wow, that is just unbelievable growth that can occur over 5 years. And hearing you walk through this breakdown really makes me think of a recent quote. One of our clients said, "All code, including test code, could be considered a financial liability, especially over a long period of time." So I'm curious, Scott, what is your take on that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with how you're looking at this. The more code you have, the more code you have that could fail at any given time. So the more test code you have, the more test runs needed to be completed, et cetera, et cetera. Things just keep building on each other. One way to look at it is, if you have one house with 100 square feet versus a house with 10,000 square feet, the cost to replace the roof is going to grow substantially. Same thing with a car going from um, a lower price or older car that doesn't have too many bells and whistles to something that is extremely complex and where it has more failure points. There's just going to be more labor involved in fixing these things because there are more points of failure for those. So yeah, I think that's a really wise way to look at this.
Yeah, I love the analogy of the house. I know about you. I've had to replace roof before, and the bigger the house, the higher the bill. But now that we've talked about exactly what the key drivers are and how those impact labor hours, I think another important consideration for understanding the total cost of ownership is knowing exactly how these costs are packaged together and billed, which is going to take us to a short conversation about billing models that are pretty common here. So, Scott, maybe you can walk me through it. Why is it so important to understand how an automated QA vendor bills for their services?
Yeah, I think the quickest or the easiest answer is that knowledge is power, especially in the buying process. I think asymmetry of information is what really evens out a marketplace. So Redfin and Zillow did it with real estate. And I think the more you know, especially when you're going into negotiations or you're going in to purchase something, the better you're going to come out with a better deal. And also just going to understand what you're getting into. So when you really understand how most traditional vendors charge for QA, you can ask different questions. You can really approach it in a different way than maybe you would if you had never known like how things bill. So that's why we want to go through really quick and mention like what are the different billing models for most traditional outsourced vendors.
Well, yeah. Well, go ahead and give me that the extra context there for maybe for people who aren't as familiar. I mean, what are those common approaches to scoping and billing for a project with an outsourced automated QA vendor?
Yeah, so what we have on the slide right here, there are three main ones. There's going to be bill by the hour, there's going to be flat rate billing, and then there's going to be staff augmentation. Each one has pros and cons. We'll just go high level, just kind of talk about each. So the first one, billing by the hour. So this usually includes infrastructure costs baked into the contract. So no lunch is free. If you sign with someone, if they're going to be running whether it's sequential or parallel runs, they're probably going to be passing that on to you if you're paying in the hourly billing model. So you're billed by the time spent to get the job done. So you're not really paying for the result. You're paying for the time that goes into producing, hopefully, the intended result. So contracts are commonly pay as you go, and a lot of the time you'll purchase a minimum bucket of work. So typically about 4 hours you're going to purchase before they continue doing more work for you. It's a very rare case if you're able to buy 10 minutes at a time or 30 minutes at a time. One advantage to this model is you can usually terminate at any time. Um, some vendors bake in infrastructure, but most of the time they do not, as I mentioned. And many others will actually even have that as a separate line item in the contract. So because it might be so volatile, you don't know if you're going to run this thing once a week or 10 times a week. So it may be a separate line item that you pay as you go for infrastructure as well. Either way, they're going to be passing the labor and the infrastructure onto you. The next one in the middle is flat rate billing. So you're billed based on a set number of hours. So change orders can be made at any time to increase the hours in the contract, but essentially you're going to go out there, you're going to say, I want to get this project done. You work together. They say it's going to cost about or it's gonna, in terms of time, but be about 160 hours. What good is that if it's, you pay 160 hours, they get it done sooner, great. If it's 160 hours, it takes 190 hours, then you may have to pay a little bit more, and you go to a change order, you start paying the hourly rate anyway. And so, this one is a little bit more rare, especially in the QA space. Where you'll see it more often is just for the creation of tests, where you'll be very hard pressed to find it outside of someone like QA Wolf, is when you get to the maintenance stage, just because that is so volatile. Whether how many times you're going to run it per day or per week varies, and you can't really time that for how many hours you're going to need. And so, one pro to this though is you can limit your exposure to an outsourced vendor when you have a fixed rate. So that's one of the nice things about it, and you can try to define it as closely as possible within your contract ahead of time. Then the third one is staff augmentation. So in this model, you pay a monthly rate for a dedicated headcount with a set number of hours. So typically 40 hours a week, 4 weeks in a month, it's going to be 160 hours. So you're still billed hourly, but you're actually committing way more upfront to be able to get a dedicated personnel. One advantage to this approach is you're getting someone in the QA engineering function that knows that function really well. And they're essentially like a full time employee to you. But the downside to that is if you need 180 hours, so they may not be able to give you a partial person. They may end up having to charge you an incremental another 160 hours. You may not need that 160 hours, or you may only use 130 of those hours, but they're still going to charge you for those 160 hours. Um, we're going to get into that in just a second as well, to show how this impacts the billing models. But that is typically how outsourced vendors charge.
Yeah, I think that's a really thorough breakdown. And again, just sort of identifying exactly what are some key things to be asking any automated QA vendor about exactly how they're billing for their services. But let's bring it back to total cost of ownership, Scott. How do each of these billing models impact that total cost of ownership over time?
Yeah, if you're looking at the hourly billing and staff augmentation, because they charge by the hour, you as the customer, you're assuming the risk of ballooning costs. So the moment you guys start, the customer is assuming the risk, and the reason this happens is because the vendor also does not know how many things you're going to need, how much labor is going to be involved, how many times you're going to run this thing, and so they want to shift the weight of the burden of the risk onto you. So keeping the key drivers, which are suite size and run cadence in mind, as the complexity of an application grows, the more test runs and labor hours will also be necessary to maintain the same quality level of coverage that you want as a team. So because the test suite grows, the amount of unique failures, as we mentioned before, also grows. Everything is ballooning, and when everything balloons, what we're really talking about is labor hours. There's going to be more labor hours associated with every single thing that's happening here. Um, so that's when you're looking at billing by the hour. That's really where a lot of the expense come from. And then when you're looking at the fixed rate model, you're potentially putting the quality of your coverage severely at risk, especially if you can't afford to add more hours throughout a change order. So yes, the cost is controlled, but limited hours means the coverage could be selectively applied, right? So if you only have so many hours, you may be forced to say, hey, I actually, I need to conserve this. I can only spend this much. I'm going to sacrifice. I'm going to allow these things to be exposed and not tested because I really need to make sure that these other things are because we're within a set limit. And when you do that, you're having a trade off of coverage. So what? Yes, you may really have 1,000 tests automated, but if you're only ever running 100 of those because of cost constraints, you don't really have high coverage. That's kind of it's a little misleading. It's a little bit like fake coverage because yes, you have them there, but if you can't run them, they're not really worth anything. When you're looking at the different cost models, those are the things to consider with those.
Mm. Yeah, and I just to bring it back to something I think you hit on pretty well. It seems like most of these billing models here are really putting emphasis on time, which really seems to me like it's at odds with keeping maintenance costs low. For example, especially again if that test suite is growing over a 5-year period. So this has me, like, just thinking like, okay, what if instead of putting the emphasis on labor hours, we were able to focus a little more on the actual results, which is comprehensive test coverage. What if we put the emphasis on that and we charge by that sort of outcome instead of by the labor hour? So let's take a look at a newer billing model that's really starting to shake things up among a lot of automated QA vendors out there, which is billing by the test. So Scott, earlier you walked us through everything that goes into a test. Just quick recap again: our test creation, test runs, investigation, maintenance, and reporting. Paying per test includes all of these into one fixed rate. So, Scott, maybe you can elaborate here for me. How does paying per test help flatten the cost growth curve for the total cost of ownership over time?
Yeah, the common denominator in everything that we've talked about so far in the four different scenarios is labor costs. And so when you go with a traditional outsourced vendor, they are charging you for those labor costs. So if you were to look at it scientifically and say, how can you flatten this curve? Well, the first thing that comes to mind that's going to reduce 90% of the cost is to remove the labor that's associated with it. Don't have customers pay for the labor. And that is the simplest answer when you're looking to reduce this thing. So, yeah, when you're looking to flatten the curve and when you're looking to figure out how can you actually make it so people adopt high coverage, so people continue running it, so they don't just have 1,000 tests but only run 100 of them. But when they have 1,000 tests and they run all 1,000 tests and they run them 5 times per day, the answer that we've been able to come up with and we strongly believe in is charging per the test and not charging per the labor hour. Um, this includes the maintenance time, this includes the execution time of the test, so also including compute time. When you just pay for the test, it doesn't matter if someone runs this thing 100 times, if it fails 1,000 times, if they have to rerun it um, because of failures and have the compute time go up. None of this really matters because all you're doing is you're paying a flat fee per test per month. And we found that it's very predictable from the buying side. You know exactly how much you're going to be paying each month. You can also try to figure out how many tests you're going to need so you can see your exposure. And then your team is also not going to have any risks in their head of, am I going to go over our limit? Am I going to be the one responsible for accidentally going over budget and charging us X thousand dollars more? Instead, your team's going to know they can run these tests as often as they like without any consequence. And so this is a lot of the time, this is something that isn't really voiced or talked about among engineering teams because they'd rather just not do it and lay low and not be the one to have to ask about this or accidentally do that. So we found that when you charge per test, it incentivizes a lot of really great things while also lowering the cost curve for teams that adopt it this way.
Well, I mean, I think when you put it that way, Scott, it really seems like no additional charges for test runs. It seems like a pretty attractive approach to billing, especially if you're an engineering leader out there who's focused again on actually getting results, i.e., comprehensive test coverage, and being able to control those steady growth costs versus things sort of ballooning out of control. But I want to take this a step further. I love hearing about this. It sounds great in theory, but I'd like to see exactly how the total cost of ownership compares on that 5-year curve. So let's prove it out here. Let's look at this graph. Now, I want to take us back to the graph we actually looked at the very beginning of the presentation, highlighting the upward trend for the total cost of ownership over 5 years. Now, before we were looking at over a model using traditional billing models, but we've added an extra line here to show you how that compares to the pay per test or charge per test billing model. So, Scott, walk me through it here. How exactly do the cost of paying per test compare when you factor in the variables of suite size and release velocity?
Yeah, so the chart you're seeing here, the black line is paying per the hour, and then the blue line is or purple line is paying per test. And so, as you alluded to, in the first year, it's pretty close. It is still less expensive for the exact same thing to run at a per test model. It's about $30,000 cheaper. But really, where you start seeing the gains and savings is over the next 2, 3, 4 years, right? So when you're looking at that 5-year total cost of ownership, it's just very clear that paying per test is going to be way more effective than paying per hour. Now, of course, the more tests you have, the more you're going to pay, right? Like that is going to happen, but it's going to be significantly less than when you're paying by the hour. And a really good way that we like to think about this is what percentage of your budget, your engineering budget, is going towards QA, and then also what percentage of your engineering headcount salaries is inside is QA. So we found about on average, probably about 19 to 20% of an engineering team's salary is within outsourced traditional QA when paying by the hour. And then when you're paying by the test, less than 3% of an engineer's headcount salary is being allocated towards QA. And so the cost curve grows more slowly when you pay by the test than when you pay by the hour. Um, and then charging by the test helps flatten things out. Way more predictable. You can kind of see, okay, I'm going to add 100 new tests the next year, this is exactly how much I'm going to pay. Versus if you say that hourly, you have no idea how much you're going to pay unless you try to model it out in Excel like we've done here.
Wow, I mean, Scott, the numbers are pretty staggering, and again, if I'm an engineering leader looking at the best bang for my buck or getting the greatest ROI, I think getting guaranteed coverage for that same time, not just busy work, is going to really make a world of difference. The pay per test billing model really seems like a winner in this specific regard. We are about out of time, but I do want to just put a pen or a period exclamation point on the conversation we have here today by bringing it back to the initial question that we asked about the total cost of ownership from the beginning of the presentation, which is why is it important to consider the full investment of an automated QA contract when looking at vendor options? So, Scott, with that in mind, what closing recommendation do you have for engineering leaders exploring automated QA vendors today?
Yeah, I'd say the first thing is when you're looking at this investment, think long term and not short term. It is a long term strategy. You're essentially bringing in another part of your engineering team, and for a lot of companies, engineering is a very large, prioritized focus of their company. And so, when you're investing in this team, make sure that you have a quality product that's being put out to the world. And so, look at this over a 5 year period, not just a single year or even a couple months. Um, the other thing is without careful planning, without understanding how a lot of traditional outsourced vendors work, you may catch yourself going into a cost curve like we're looking at right here, where things balloon up because you're paying by the hour. Um, another thing is just understand what goes into a test. Have that knowledge and have that power when you go into talks and conversations, and ask the vendors, even if it's us, ask us. What happens when you run 100 times a month? Ask them what is their typical failure rate. Ask them how long it takes them to maintain a test on average. Get all these different numbers out so you can start trying to figure out how much it's going to cost you over the long run. I'd also recommend trying to figure out how many tests you're going to need in year one, year two, year three. So, when you put all these together, and again, one of the bigger takeaways I want to say is when you work with a company that charges per the hour, they're counting on you to take on that risk. They're counting to, hey, they just want to deliver a result, a product, and they want you to pay for it. It doesn't matter if it's going to be $100 or $1 million. All their job to do is to deliver that product. But when you work with a company that charges per test, that company is then putting the burden of risk on themselves, and they're saying, this could take me one labor hour, or it could take me 100, and because of that, it incentivizes that company to figure out ways to lower the labor, but still increase or still maintain and increase the results that are going out there. And so when you work with these two different types of companies, try to figure out which one do you want to work with. Do you want to work with someone where they can't give you a fixed rate on maintenance and on test runs because they themselves don't know how much it's going to cost? Or do you want to work with someone that takes that bet and says internally as a company that, hey, we don't know how many labor hours it's going to cost, but we're going to invent the technology, we're going to invent the processes to make sure that we can still deliver this to the customer so they can have a very predictable budget that they can work with. And all they have to focus on is growth in their engineering team and going to market. They don't have to focus on going to their finance partner, trying to put together an entire model, figuring out how much it's going to cost year to year. Um, so that's what I hope was a takeaway of this webinar. Just really understanding what goes into working with an outsourced vendor, and just having a little bit more knowledge, leaving with a little bit more knowledge when you go negotiate those purchases.
Yeah, I think all that is some really great advice to consider. And again, proofs in the pudding in terms of the savings. I mean, companies that bill by the test are going to be 70.4% less expensive on average than a traditional outsourced QA vendor over a 5 year period. So, Scott, I appreciate the insight, the charts, and the recommendations for everyone who's watching today. But unfortunately, we are out of time. Now, for everyone who's tuning in, we've talked about how paper test, the paper test business model can help you lower your overall total cost of ownership. And you might be asking yourself, well, that seems like a pretty ambitious task, what Scott was describing. Taking on that risk could be pretty significant. If that's true, how is it possible to keep up with all of those tests at scale? Well, if you want to see how QA Wolf's technology delivers on our promises to customers by using that pay per test billing model, you can head on over to QAWolf.com and requesting a demo today so you can see it in action yourself. Scott, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure chatting with you today.
Yeah, thank you, Caleb.
And for everyone else who's watching, thank you so much for joining us. You can check out more information and more webinars like these over at QAWolf.com. Have a great day.